On the 26th of February, 2026, a single sentence ended an era. Stanley Black & Decker would close its last factory in New Britain, Connecticut, silencing 183 years of manufacturing in the town that bore its name. This was no ordinary closure. For generations, New Britain was Hardware City, the hardware capital of the world. Stanley Tools were forged here, shipped from here, and worn smooth in the hands of builders worldwide. The thunder of its machines was the heartbeat of a whole community. Then, one cold winter morning, that heartbeat simply stopped. The presses fell silent. The workers who had given their lives to this place walked out, not because the company had failed, but because it had decided they were no longer worth keeping. How does a company still worth billions abandon the very town that gave it its name? What follows is the rise of a humble workshop of bolts and hinges into a global empire, and the slow abandonment of the place that gave that empire everything. New Britain, Connecticut, 1843 to 2026. In 1843, in a small Connecticut town few outside the state had ever heard of, a 41-year-old man opened a modest workshop and began making bolts. His name was Frederick Trent Stanley, and he was, by most measures, an unlikely founder of anything. He had drifted through a string of jobs: a clerk aboard a Connecticut River steamboat, a traveling peddler hawking goods across the American South. More tellingly, he had already failed once. A decade earlier, in 1831, he and his brother William had opened a small shop making door locks and house trimmings, only to watch it collapse in the financial panic of 1837. But Frederick had learned something from that ruin. When he returned to New Britain and founded Stanley's Bolt Manufactory in 1843, he brought with him an obsession that would outlive him by nearly 2 centuries, a refusal to make anything cheaply. His wrought iron bolts and hinges were not the cheapest in town. New Britain was already crowded with small foundries fighting over the same customers. But they were among the finest, and quality, Frederick wagered, would win. It did. As demand grew, he expanded into hooks, hinges, and other builders' hardware, and in 1852 the business was incorporated as a separate company, the Stanley Works. It nearly died in its first year. The new venture lost money, and something had to change. So in 1854, Frederick took a gamble that would define everything to come. He hired a 19-year-old named William Hart. Hart was no ordinary clerk. Within months, he was promoted to secretary and treasurer, and over the decades that followed, he became the true engine of Stanley's rise. He redesigned the company's machinery, streamlined its packaging to sell hardware faster, and, most importantly, pioneered the process of cold rolling steel. By the 1880s, Stanley had become the first company to replace traditional wrought iron with steel in its builders' hardware, a leap that gave its products a strength and consistency its rivals simply could not match. While Hart engineered the rise, Frederick built something less tangible, a bond between the company and the town. He helped bring New Britain its first gas lighting and its first running water, and when the city was formally incorporated in 1871, it was Frederick Stanley who became its first mayor. The man and the place were, from the very beginning, woven together. By the time he died in 1883, the company's capital had multiplied more than tenfold. But the Stanley name was about to grow bigger still, and stranger. In 1857, Frederick's cousin, Henry Stanley, had founded an entirely separate firm across town, the Stanley Rule and Level Company, makers of planes, rules, and measuring tools so precise they would one day be prized by craftsmen the world over. For decades, The two Stanleys ran as rivals and neighbors. Then, in 1920, they merged. The bolt maker and the tool maker became one, and the tools that would carry the Stanley name into millions of homes, the planes, the levels, and eventually the tape measures, were folded into a single, formidable enterprise. The foundation was laid. A failed shopkeeper's stubborn faith in quality had become an empire in waiting. And in the decades to come, that empire would not merely grow. It would make New Britain the center of an entire world. By the early 20th century, the empire Frederick Stanley had imagined was no longer confined to a single workshop. It had swallowed the town whole. The nickname, Hardware City, was not granted lightly, nor to Stanley alone. It was earned by the dense cluster of foundries and toolworks that had grown up around Stanley's gates, until New Britain produced more builders' hardware than almost anywhere on Earth. If a carpenter in London, Sydney, or Cape Town reached for a hinge, a latch, or a level, there was a fair chance it had been forged in this one Connecticut city. But Hardware City was never only about hardware. It was about people. And above all, about the people who came from somewhere else. The factories of the industrial age ran on immigrant hands, wave after wave of newcomers, Polish, Italian, and Irish among them, poured into New Britain, drawn by a single, powerful promise that here a man with no money and no name could find steady work, raise a family, and build a life. The mills needed them, and they needed the mills. Out of that bargain, an entire community took shape around the rhythm of the Stanley whistle. It was a world unto itself. The company ran its own industrial league, where works teams, Stanley Tools, Stanley Hardware, Stanley Steel, fielded sides that competed against one another once the day's shifts had ended. Families measured their lives by the factory, where their fathers had worked, where their sons would work, where everyone simply knew where the factory stood, because the factory was the town. And when America went to war, Hardware City went with it. During the Second World War, the same plants that had turned out hinges and planes were retooled for the fight. In 1943, women stood at the Stanley benches, inspecting bullet jackets for the smallest flaw, while down the line, incendiary bomb casings took shape for the war effort. The tools of peacetime had become the instruments of war, and New Britain delivered. This was Stanley at its height, not merely a company, but a civilization in miniature, with its own culture, its own loyalties, its own fierce pride. Frederick's old creed, that quality would win, had been vindicated on a scale he could never have dreamt of. Yet pride and loyalty were only half the story. Behind the ball games and the family dinners stood something colder and far more relentless, the machine itself, and the machine was extraordinary. To understand Stanley at its peak, you had to understand its scale. This was no longer a workshop turning out bolts by hand. By the middle of the 20th century, Stanley had become an industrial giant, its New Britain plants humming around the clock. Under the leadership of Chief Executive John C. Cairns, who ran the company from 1950 to 1966, Stanley swallowed up rival firms and poured money into modernizing its lines. In 1957 alone, it opened a state-of-the-art steel-strapping plant in New Britain, 115,000 square feet of new capacity that nearly doubled the firm's output of that single product. And then there was the tool that would become the company's signature, the tape measure. It is hard today to grasp how ordinary and how extraordinary that object was. A coil of marked steel in a pocket-sized case, unglamorous, almost invisible. And yet it found its way into the toolbox of nearly every builder, joiner, and weekend handyman in the Western world. The New Britain operation churned them out by the tens of millions. Even in recent years, a single line there still produced close to 30 million tape measures a year. Stanley did not merely make tools. It set the standard by which everyone else measured, quite literally. All of this rested on one thing: people, thousands of them. At its peak, Stanley employed thousands of machinists across multiple plants in and around New Britain. A small army of skilled hands who knew steel the way a musician knows an instrument. To work at Stanley was not simply to hold a job. It was an identity, often passed from father to son, that came with a wage a man could raise a family on and a pension he could retire on. One of those workers was a man named Steve Cambria. We will hear from him again much later and in very different circumstances. For now, it is enough to know that he was one of the countless men who gave their working lives to the Stanley plants and who would one day become a living witness to what those plants had been and to what would become of them. Because here is the thing about peaks. By definition, you only recognize them once they are behind you. In the 1950s, no one stood on the factory floor and thought, "This is as good as it will ever get." The orders kept coming, the lines kept running, the whistle kept blowing. The idea that this mighty machine, this civilization of steel and sweat, might one day fall silent would have seemed not merely unlikely, but absurd. And yet, even as Stanley reached its height, something was beginning to stir far beyond the borders of New Britain. A new kind of competition was forming, one that no amount of pride, loyalty, or craftsmanship could fully withstand. The first cracks were about to appear. For more than a century, Stanley had operated on a simple, almost moral principle: make the best, and the world will buy it. For most of that time, it had been right. But beginning in the 1960s, the rules of the game quietly changed, and Stanley, like every American metalworking firm, found itself playing on a board it no longer controlled. The threat came from abroad. As the economies of Japan and later much of Asia and Europe rebuilt and roared after the Second World War, they began producing tools and hardware of their own. And they produced them cheaply. A hammer was a hammer. A hinge was a hinge. To a builder counting his costs, it mattered less and less whether the steel had been forged in New Britain or shipped halfway across the world, so long as it held. Metalworking, it turned out, was a hidebound, mature industry. And few industries proved more exposed to foreign competition than this one. For a company that had built its entire identity on craftsmanship, this was a slow and disorienting kind of poison. Quality still mattered, but quality alone no longer won. Increasingly, the question on every buyer's lips was not "how good is it?" but "how cheap is it?" And on that question, a factory full of well-paid American machinists was always going to struggle against a factory full of workers earning a fraction of the wage. New Britain was not alone in feeling this. Across America, the great manufacturing towns of the Northeast and the Midwest were entering a long, grinding decline that would one day earn a grim name: the Rust Belt. One by one, the mills and foundries that had built the American middle class were undercut, outpaced, and, eventually, shut. New Britain now sat squarely in the path of that storm. Stanley did not collapse under this pressure. It was far too large, too established, too clever for that. But the cracks showed early. As the company entered the 1960s, its leadership was widely seen as having grown comfortable, even complacent, coasting on past glories while the ground shifted beneath it. The empire was still standing, but it was no longer striding. What saved Stanley, for a time, was reinvention. Under a new generation of leadership, most notably Donald W. Davis, who made his home in New Britain and carried on the founder's old tradition of community engagement. The company modernized, diversified, and pushed aggressively into markets around the globe. It expanded its range far beyond bolts and hinges. It became, in time, the world leader in hand tools, with manufacturing operations spread across many countries. And there lay the quiet, fateful logic of the decades to come. To survive in a world of cheap competition, Stanley had to chase lower costs. To chase lower costs, it had to look beyond New Britain, beyond Connecticut, beyond America altogether. The very strategy that kept the company alive and growing also began slowly and almost imperceptibly to loosen the bond between Stanley and the town that had made it. Production that had once been unthinkable to move could now be moved. Workers who had once been the company's pride could now, on a balance sheet, be reclassified as a cost. No one announced this shift. There was no single memo, no dramatic vote, no headline. It happened in the language of strategy and efficiency, in boardrooms far from the factory floor. But it was, in hindsight, the most important change of all, more important than any single import, recession, or competitor. For more than 100 years, Stanley had asked, how do we make the best tools in the world? Now, increasingly, it asked a different question. How do we make them for less? It is one of the oldest stories in business, and one of the saddest. A company does not usually betray its people in a single act of villainy. It does so gradually, reasonably, one defensible decision at a time, until one day it looks up and finds that the thing it set out to protect has quietly become the thing it is willing to sacrifice. That logic had now taken root inside Stanley, and in the winter of 2002, it would surface in a way that stunned the entire United States. A decision so brazen that it would turn a humble toolmaker into a national symbol of corporate greed. In February 2002, Stanley Works made an announcement that, on paper, looked almost boring. The company said it intended to change its legal address, not its factories, not its headquarters in New Britain, not a single job, a single machine, or a single tool. Stanley would carry on making hardware in Connecticut exactly as before. What it proposed to change was something far more abstract and far more lucrative. It would reincorporate itself in Bermuda. To the public, it sounded like accounting jargon. To the people who understood it, it was a bombshell. The maneuver had a name, a corporate inversion. In plain terms, Stanley would create a new parent company in Bermuda, an island with no income tax, and place its American business beneath it. Nothing physical would move. There would be no Bermudan factory, no Bermudan workforce. In practice, little more than a post office box on a sunny island thousands of miles away. But on the books, Stanley would no longer be a fully American company, and that single change of address was expected to save it roughly $30 million a year in US taxes. $30 million every year for the cost of a postbox. The man at the helm was the chairman and chief executive, John Tranney. And he was about to learn that timing, in business as in life, is everything, because the timing could hardly have been worse. It was 2002. The wreckage of the September 11th attacks still smoldered in the American imagination. The cleanup at Ground Zero was barely finished. The country was raw, grieving, and fiercely patriotic. At the very same moment, a wave of corporate scandals, Enron chief among them, had shattered public trust in big business, exposing executives who enriched themselves while ordinary workers and shareholders were left with nothing. In truth, Stanley had not invented the idea. Since the mid-1990s, more than 20 large American firms had quietly slipped their legal residence to havens such as Bermuda and the Cayman Islands. among them Stanley's own rival, Cooper Industries, and the engineering giant Ingersoll Rand. The move was entirely legal, but Stanley, with its all-American name and its all-American history, had chosen the worst possible moment to do something so many others had done in the shadows. It was about to become the face of them all. The reaction was immediate, and it was savage. The condemnation came from every direction at once. Unions denounced it, newspapers savaged it, the US Treasury took notice, and in Washington, politicians of both parties seized on Stanley as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with corporate America. The toolmaker that had once stood for American grit now stood accused of deserting the country. In the Senate, the response was swift and bipartisan. Senators Chuck Grassley and Max Baucus, the two most powerful figures on the Finance Committee, introduced legislation aimed squarely at companies fleeing offshore for tax reasons, under the pointed title of the Reversing the Expatriation of Profits Offshore Act. One senior senator branded the move shameful. A company pulling up stakes, he said, while the rubble of Ground Zero was barely cleared. Patriotism, the critics charged, had taken a back seat to profit, exactly as the cynics had predicted it would, once the rawest grief of September 11th began to fade. To its credit, Stanley had a defense, and it was not a foolish one. Its allies, including the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, argued that the company was not a villain, but a victim of a broken system. America, almost alone among major nations, taxed its companies on income earned anywhere in the world, at one of the highest rates going. That, they said, put American firms at a crippling disadvantage against foreign rivals, the very rivals already undercutting Stanley on price. If the law made it punishing to stay American, was it really so wicked to leave? The fault, they insisted, lay with the tax code, not with the company. It was a reasonable argument. It did not matter. In the court of public opinion, no spreadsheet could compete with the image of a beloved American toolmaker bolting for a Caribbean tax haven while the nation mourned. Stanley's shareholders, persuaded by the numbers, voted to approve the move. But the political and public firestorm only grew hotter, until, in August 2002, Stanley blinked. The company abandoned the plan entirely. It would remain, legally, an American company after all. Officially, Stanley said it had dropped the scheme because Congress now seemed likely to fix the tax code anyway. Few were fooled. Stanley had retreated because the backlash had become unbearable. And so, in the end, Stanley never did move to Bermuda. Not one job was lost to it. To this day, no major American company has attempted quite the same maneuver since. So why does it matter? Because of what it revealed. For one brief, unguarded moment, the mask had slipped. A company founded on a creed of quality and community. A company once inseparable from the very town that bore its name, had been willing to renounce its own nationality to shave a number on a tax return. The bond between Stanley and the place that made it, already loosening for decades, had now been openly tested in front of the entire country. It had survived, but only just. And the deeper drift, the slow, quiet movement of real work, real machines, and real jobs away from New Britain, was about to accelerate in a way no postbox in Bermuda ever could. For the empire was about to make the biggest deal in its history. If Bermuda had been about escaping the rules, what came next was about rewriting them through sheer size. On the 12th of March 2010, Stanley Works completed the largest deal in its 167-year history. It merged with the Black and Decker Corporation. The Maryland firm founded a century earlier, in 1910, by Duncan Black and Alonzo Decker, and famous the world over for its power tools. The two companies became one, and the combined giant took a new name that would soon be stamped on toolboxes everywhere: Stanley Black and Decker. This was no small bolt-on acquisition. It was, in effect, a marriage of equals. Under the terms of the deal, every Black and Decker share was converted into 1.275 shares of the new company, and Stanley's existing shareholders ended up owning roughly half of the combined business. The chief executive, John Lundgren, hailed the union as the dawn of an exciting new future. Overnight, Stanley Black and Decker became the largest toolmaker on the planet. Its portfolio was staggering: hand tools, power tools, fixings, fasteners, and industrial equipment, sold under a roll call of brands recognized in workshops from Manchester to Melbourne. The little bolt manufactory that Frederick Stanley had founded in a single Connecticut workshop was now a global colossus worth many billions of dollars. And, crucially for New Britain, the headquarters of this new empire would remain right there, in the town where it had all begun. To the people of Hardware City, that last detail mattered enormously. In an age when American companies routinely abandoned their hometowns for glossier addresses, Stanley was staying put, at least in name. The sign over the door still said New Britain. The town could still call itself the home of a Fortune 500 giant. It felt like a victory. In truth, it was something closer to a consolation prize, and a temporary one at that, because there was a hard logic buried inside that triumphant merger, and it pointed in only one direction. To compete in a brutal global market, the new company needed scale, efficiency, and the lowest possible costs. And the more global it became, the less any single town, even its own birthplace, could expect to matter. The empire was now far bigger than the place that had built it, and empires, in the end, go where the numbers lead. Here lies the cruel paradox at the heart of Stanley's story. The strategy worked, the company thrived, and that success is precisely what doomed New Britain. For Stanley Black and Decker, the years after the merger were, by most corporate measures, a triumph. It grew, it acquired, it expanded into new markets and new technologies. Its brands sold by the millions across the globe. By any spreadsheet a shareholder might read, this was a winning company. But a spreadsheet does not record what was quietly happening in Connecticut. For more than a generation, the actual making of things, the work that had defined New Britain for over a century, had been slipping away. Plant by plant, line by line, decision by reasonable decision, production drifted to where it was cheaper to produce, to lower-cost American states, and increasingly to factories overseas. None of it was announced with fanfare. There was no single day on which Hardware City fell. It simply thinned year after year, like a tide going out so slowly that no one could say exactly when the water had left. And so a strange New Britain took shape, one that kept the prestige of Stanley without the substance of it. The town still hosted the global headquarters of a multinational giant. Executives still came to work each morning beneath the Stanley name. But the roar of the machines, the shift whistle, the working hands that had once given the town its identity, those were fading into memory. For the men and women of New Britain, this was the difference between two entirely different kinds of city. A headquarters employs accountants, lawyers, and managers in quiet offices. A factory employs the town. A headquarters offers a few hundred white-collar salaries. A factory offers thousands of working families a foothold in the middle class. A wage you could raise children on. A job your son might one day inherit. You cannot replace the second with the first. They are not the same animal, and everyone in New Britain knew it. This was the Great Hollowing. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow, methodical emptying out. carried along on the irresistible current of globalization and shareholder expectation. The company was not run by villains twirling their mustaches. It was run by intelligent people making defensible decisions, each one logical on its own terms, all of them adding up to the steady dismantling of the very thing that had created the company in the first place. By the 2000s, the question was no longer whether Stanley would keep making tools in New Britain. It was how much longer any of it could possibly last. And then came a shock that no one in the boardroom had planned for. A global upheaval that would first hand the company a windfall, then turn on it savagely, and finally tip the long, quiet drift into a brutal, accelerating fall. It began, of all places, with a pandemic. In early 2020, the world locked its doors. As the coronavirus pandemic swept across the globe and lockdowns confined millions to their homes, something unexpected happened to the tool business. It boomed. Trapped indoors with time on their hands and nowhere to spend their money, people rediscovered their houses. They built decks and painted bedrooms, fixed leaking taps, and tackled the jobs they had put off for years. And to do all that, they needed tools. Demand for Stanley Black and Decker's products surged. Orders poured in faster than the company could fill them. So Stanley did what any company would do in the face of a gold rush. It ramped up. It expanded production and piled up inventory, racing to meet a wave of consumer spending unlike anything the industry had seen in years. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it looked like a renaissance. It was a trap. Because the boom was never built to last. As the pandemic receded, life returned to normal, and the home improvement frenzy faded just as quickly as it had arrived. Worse, the world's central banks, fighting a surge of inflation, began raising interest rates sharply. Borrowing grew expensive. Big-ticket spending cooled. And suddenly, the very things that had felt like triumph, all those expanded factories, all that stockpiled inventory, curdled into a crisis. Stanley found itself drowning in unsold goods, squeezed by thinning margins, and carrying a swollen pile of debt. The feast had become a famine almost overnight. Something had to give, and in a modern corporation, when something has to give, there is only ever one answer: cut. The response had a bland, corporate name: the Global Cost Reduction Program. Its goal was anything but bland. Stanley Black and Decker set out to strip more than $2 billion in costs from the business. $2 billion. To grasp what that means in human terms, you have to understand what cost looks like on a balance sheet. Cost is rent. Cost is materials. But more than anything, cost is people and the places they work. The program was ruthless, and it was effective. Within a few years, it had wrung out some $2.1 billion in run rate savings. By the end of 2024, the company reported around $1.5 billion saved and had slashed its bloated inventory by more than $2 billion. The restructuring came at a price the company recorded plainly in its own accounts: roughly $141 million in charges in 2022 and another $39 million in 2023. Charges tied directly to cutting jobs and shutting facilities. And shut facilities it did. Plants in South Carolina and Texas went dark. Whole businesses were sold off, including the company's aerospace components arm, offloaded for $1.8 billion in cash. The portfolio was reshaped, trimmed, and streamlined by a leadership determined to restore the profitability the pandemic hangover had stolen. In October 2025, a new chief executive, Chris Nelson, took the helm to drive the turnaround harder still. To investors, it was a disciplined rescue of a struggling giant. To anyone working in a Stanley factory, it was something far more frightening. Because a $2 billion cost-cutting program does not search for savings at random. It hunts for the most expensive operations first. The older plants, the higher wages, the unionized workforces, the facilities in costly corners of the country. And no facility on Earth fitted that description more perfectly than the original. The hometown plant, the expensive, unionized, aging operation in high-cost Connecticut, making a product the world was slowly leaving behind. New Britain had a target on its back and had done for years. The only question left was when. Meanwhile, in that same autumn of 2025, life in New Britain carried on as it always had. People needed work. And the Stanley plant, for all the rumours, for all the slow bleed of the decades, was still a Stanley plant, still running, still hiring, still one of the best jobs a working man in the city could hope for. One of the people who reached for that hope was a local resident named Sean Cullen. Late in 2025, he put in an application to work at the factory. He had every reason to be optimistic. The plant was open, the line was moving, tape measures were still rolling off it by the million. He had no way of knowing that, even as he waited to hear back, executives far from New Britain had already begun preparing an announcement that would close those doors for good. The countdown to the final day had begun. It came on an ordinary Thursday. On the morning of the 26th of February, 2026, word began to spread through New Britain that something was wrong at the Stanley plant on Myrtle Street. By the afternoon, the company had made it official, in a statement so brief and so bloodless that it seemed almost designed to wound. Stanley Black & Decker would close the Myrtle Street facility. The reason, the company explained, was a structural decline in demand for single-sided tape measures, the product the plant chiefly made. These products, a spokeswoman said, were quickly becoming obsolete. Obsolete. Pause on that word, because the irony of it is almost unbearable. For the better part of 2 centuries, Stanley had been the company that taught the world to measure. The tape measure was its signature, its icon, the humble tool that had carried its name into millions of hands. And now the company was shutting the doors on its hometown plant because that very tool, the single-sided tape measure, had been left behind by the modern world. The measurer had been measured and found wanting. The plant itself had opened in 1963. For more than 6 decades, generations of New Britain families had passed through its gates. Fathers and sons, husbands and wives, neighbours and friends, all bound together by the same work. Around 300 people still worked there on the day the announcement came. By the time it was over, every one of those jobs would be gone, ending Stanley's long history of making things in the very city that had given the company its name. The news travelled fast, and the cameras came quickly. Television crews and reporters descended on the hardware city to tell a story that, by 2026, had become wearily familiar across America's old factory towns. Another legacy employer, another shuttered plant, another community asked to absorb a loss it had no say in. The politicians spoke, as politicians do. The city's mayor, Bobby Sanchez, called the news deeply disappointing and insisted his focus was not on politics but on people. He pointed to forces far larger than New Britain: federal trade policy, tariffs, rising costs, a turbulent global economy. Across the political divide, others pointed their fingers in the opposite direction, blaming the high cost of doing business in Connecticut itself. Each side had its villain. None of it would bring back a single job. And on the factory floor, among the workers themselves, there was something colder than anger, disbelief. Many of them, represented by their union, the machinists of IAM, Locals 1433 and 1249, lodges that had stood with Stanley workers for generations. simply did not accept the company's tidy explanation. Tape measures, obsolete, they had spent their working lives watching those tape measures roll off the line by the million. The product wasn't dead. The work wasn't gone. It was simply going somewhere cheaper. And everyone in that building knew it. Somewhere across the city, a man named Sean Kalen was still waiting to hear back about a job. He had applied just months earlier, in the autumn, when the plant was running and hiring, and the future still looked open. Now he watched on the news as the door he had been reaching for was bricked up before his eyes. He had wanted a place on that line. There would be no place. There would be no line. But the announcement, however brutal, was only words. The real ending, the human ending, was still to come. The end did not arrive all at once. It came in waves. On Monday, the 4th of May, 2026, the layoffs began in earnest. The plan, set out in a formal notice to the state, was clinically precise. The great bulk of the workforce, some 287 people, would be let go in a single wave between the 4th and the 18th of May, with a handful of remaining roles trimmed away over the months that followed. The hourly workers, the people who actually made the tools, went first. Among them was a man named Anthony Cascio. For 3 years, Cascio had stood in the quality department, inspecting tape measures, checking each one for the smallest flaw, the same patient, exacting work Stanley had demanded of its people since the days of Frederick Stanley himself. He had loved the job. He had believed, as so many before him had believed, that he would one day retire from the company. So had his wife Cynthia, who had given Stanley 6 years of her own working life. Now, in a single stroke, both of them were out. A husband and wife, an entire household, cut loose together, scrambling at once for new work in a city with precious little left to offer. It hurts, Cascio said simply. 300 people, he pointed out, would now have to start all over again. What makes the Cascio story so quietly devastating is that it was not unusual. It was the rule. At the Stanley plant, the work had always been a family affair. Relatives working side by side, jobs passed down through generations, an entire community threaded through a single factory floor. When the plant fell, it did not fall on strangers. It fell on families. And then there was the parting gift. As the workers cleared out their lockers and said their goodbyes, Stanley handed each of them a keepsake. It was a tape measure, the very thing they had spent their lives making. But this one was special. This one was plated in gold. Sit with that image for a moment, because it may be the single most telling detail in this entire story. A company that had just declared the tape measure obsolete, that had closed its hometown plant and cast out 300 loyal workers in the name of cutting costs, sent them home clutching a gold-plated version of the very tool it was killing. Whether it was meant as a gesture of thanks or simply landed as a final, glittering insult, the workers themselves could decide. But there it was. The Empire's last word to the people who had built it, a souvenir of something that no longer existed. By the middle of May, it was done. The machines on Myrtle Street fell quiet. The line that had run for more than 60 years stopped. The workers who had given Stanley their days, their decades, and in many cases their families' futures, picked up their gold-plated tape measures and walked out into the late spring sun. And just like that, the sound that had defined New Britain for the better part of 2 centuries, the roar, the rhythm, the very pulse of the place, simply stopped. The thing everyone had assured themselves could never happen had finally come to pass. Stanley no longer made anything in the town that Stanley built. The factory was silent. But the story was not over. Because when a giant pulls out of the place that made it, it does not leave behind an empty space. It leaves behind a wound, and a question that New Britain and 1,000 towns like it would be left to answer alone. What does a town do the morning after? When the machines on Myrtle Street fell silent, New Britain was left to reckon with a loss that ran far beyond the 300 jobs themselves, though those jobs were devastating enough. Each one was a household, a mortgage, a family that now had to begin again. And the damage did not stop at the factory gates. Economists call it the ripple effect, and it is brutally simple. When a few hundred people in a single town lose their wages all at once, they stop spending. The corner shop, the diner, the barber, the garage, all the small businesses that quietly depend on a steady payroll, feel the cold. Workers' representatives warned of exactly this, that the closure would send a shock through the entire local economy, striking not only the laid-off families, but the neighbors and businesses who had built their lives around them. A factory, it turns out, is never just a factory. It is the beating heart of an economy of ordinary lives. But there were other losses too, quieter ones, harder to put on a balance sheet. There was the union. The machinists who had first organized at Stanley as far back as 1945 had been part of the fabric of working-class New Britain for the better part of a century. A voice, a protection, a community. With the plant gone, that voice fell quiet, one more industrial union fading from a town that had once been thick with them. And there was the giving. For generations, Stanley had honored a tradition begun by Frederick himself, the founder who had once been inseparable from this town, pouring money and care back into the community that sustained it. That philanthropy, woven through Greater Hartford for over a century, would now begin to wither. Yet here lies the strangest, most bitter twist of all. Stanley did not actually leave New Britain. Its headquarters remained, just a couple of miles from the silent plant. The Stanley name still hung over the door. But consider what was left behind. At its height, the company had given work to thousands across the city. By 2024, that number had dwindled to around 600. And with the factory closed, only the corporate offices remained, perhaps half of even that figure. A few hundred managers, accountants, and executives working quietly behind glass. A former mayor of the city put her finger on the wound. New Britain, she said, was a place of blue collars and working hands, of people who got their hands dirty and came home covered in grease. That was its soul. What remained now was a cluster of corporate jobs in quiet offices, respectable, well-paid, and utterly foreign to everything the town had ever been. To her, the news was simply a gut punch, and for the men and women who had lived the whole arc of it, the grief was sharper still. Remember Steve Cambria, the retired Stanley worker we met at the company's height. He had got out before the end. He would keep his pension and his memories, but that spared him nothing. Surveying what had become of the place he had given his working life to, he reached for an image of pure desolation. The closure, he said, was just one more tumbleweed blowing across what New Britain manufacturing had become. A dust bowl. 3 lives, 3 fates, 1 story. Sean Kalin, who reached for a place on the line and found the door already closing. Anthony and Cynthia Cassio, cast out together after years of loyal service, robbed of the retirement they had earned. And Steve Cambria, who escaped the worst of it only to watch from the outside as the world he had built turned to dust. The hopeful, the betrayed, and the bereaved, all of them left holding the same gilded, useless souvenir of a vanished age. And yet, and this matters, New Britain is not a ghost town. Connecticut still makes things. In fact, the state hums with high-value manufacturing, jet engines, submarines, advanced machinery, and thousands of skilled manufacturing jobs sit unfilled across the region. New Britain itself retains a real manufacturing base. Smaller firms still turn out everything from aircraft parts to firearms. Local leaders speak with cautious hope of reinventing the old factory sites, of a city in transition rather than in collapse. The story of Hardware City is not necessarily over. It is simply being forced, painfully, to become something new. But the deepest, most uncomfortable truth of all is not about New Britain. It is about Stanley. Because while the town it left behind was counting its losses, the empire that had walked away was doing perfectly, profitably well. Here is the fact that makes this story so hard to swallow. Stanley Black & Decker is not a failed company. It is not a cautionary tale of bankruptcy or ruin. It is a triumph. In 2024, the company posted revenues of more than $15 billion. It remained the largest toolmaker in the world, its brands stacked on the shelves of hardware shops and DIY superstores on every continent. At the end of that year, it employed some 48,500 people across 60 countries. And even after the brutal cost-cutting that followed, even after shedding thousands of jobs and trimming its global workforce to around 43,000 by the start of 2026, it remained a colossus spread across dozens of countries and a vast web of facilities. The little bolt manufactory from New Britain had become one of the great industrial enterprises on Earth. By every measure a shareholder, an analyst, or an executive might use, Frederick Stanley's creation was not dying. It was winning. And that is the whole terrible point. Because this was never a story about a company that fell. The company did not fall. New Britain fell. And the most uncomfortable truth buried in that distinction is this. The two things were never in conflict. The company did not thrive despite leaving its hometown behind. In the cold arithmetic of modern business, it may well have thrived because it did. This is the great decoupling of our age. The quiet divorce between the success of a corporation and the survival of the community that bore it. For most of human history, the two were bound together. When the local works prospered, the town prospered with it. Stanley's story is what happens when that ancient bond is finally severed. A company can now report its best numbers in years, while the place that built it counts its empty storefronts. Profit and place no longer move as one. So let us return at last to the question we began with. How does a company still worth billions abandon the very town that gave it its name? The answer, it turns out, is almost disappointingly ordinary. Not through villainy, not through a single monstrous betrayal, but through 100 years of reasonable decisions, each one defensible, each one logical, each one made by intelligent people doing exactly what the market demanded. All of them pointing inexorably away from New Britain. The empire did not hate the town that made it. It simply finally outgrew its need for it. And in business, need is the only loyalty that lasts. There is a bitter poetry in the tool at the center of it all. For more than 180 years, Stanley taught the world to measure. Its tape measures, its rules, its levels, brought precision to the hands of millions. The means to build straight, true, and exact. The company measured everything. It measured steel and costs and margins and quarterly returns with relentless, ruthless accuracy. But there was one thing the tape measure could never take the length of. It could not measure what it costs a community to lose its purpose. It could not weigh a man's pride in a job his father held before him, nor count the worth of a town that knew exactly who it was. Those things do not fit on a balance sheet, and precisely because they could not be measured, they were the first things to be sacrificed. What is left now, in New Britain, is memory. The Stanley name will forever be bound to the hardware city, not in steel any longer, but in story. It lingers in the city's parks, kept alive by an endowment the company left to preserve them. It survives in a local museum that guards the relics of an industrial age, and in the long, proud history of the workers and the unions who built something extraordinary there. The factories are gone. The legacy is not. It has simply changed form, from something you could hold in your hand into something you can only remember. And here is why this story matters far beyond one Connecticut town. Because New Britain is not unique. It is everywhere. It is the steel town and the mill town, the mining village and the motor city. Every community on earth that once poured its whole identity into a single industry, only to watch that industry decide, one quiet morning, that it could do the same thing cheaper somewhere else. Stanley's story is their story. It is the story of what we owe to the places that build us, and how easily, in the name of progress, that debt is left unpaid. The great machines of New Britain will never roar again. The gold-plated tape measures sit in drawers and on mantelpieces across the city, strange little monuments to a world that has ended. But somewhere, a child still reaches for a Stanley tape measure on a hardware shop shelf, never knowing the name on the case once belonged to a town, and to the thousands of hands that made it great. That is the legacy of Hardware City. Not the empire that left, but the people who stayed, and the truth they were left to carry. That a company can build the world, and still forget the people who built the company. If this story stayed with you, take a moment in the comments to tell us about a place like New Britain near you. A factory, a mill, a name that once meant everything to a town. Because these histories survive only as long as we keep telling them. If you'd like more deep dives into the factories and empires that shaped our world, subscribe and tap the like button so the next story finds its way to you. Thank you for watching.